Hi, this workshop is presented by Dr. Joanna Sun, an environmental design consultant. She has been working in age-friendly and dementia-enabling environments for more than a decade. In this presentation, you'll be learning about the relationship between the environment and dementia. You will also be learning about the principles of design that underpins dementia-inclusive or dementia-friendly environments in Singapore and on a global scale. In this presentation, we will cover the relationship between the brain and the environment. Followed by the design principles in Singapore, we will touch on dementia-enabling environment principles of design that are recognized globally. Do know that this presentation has been designed for people without a background in anatomy. However, this presentation can also be helpful as a refresher for individuals with a background in anatomy. Before we go on, I'd like to cover briefly about dementia. This will allow us to understand the reasoning behind the recommendations put forward within this presentation. There are an average of 86 billion neurons in a healthy brain, and the brain can handle approximately 11 million bits of information per second. Just think, as you listen to this presentation, your brain is breaking down millions of information from the text, colors, and images on this slide. You'll be able to feel and identify the computer mouse under the palm of your hand, the screen's brightness, and the ambient sound of the space you are in, and much more. Information is transmitted to the brain and back again via the muscles and organs. In dementia, we know that neurons become damaged and expire. This causes connections within the brain to deteriorate, leading to eventually widespread shrinkage of brain regions and a loss of volume. Think back to the multitude of sensory information we take to understand our environment and engage in what we do. When connections are broken and we don't have support, the environment can be very disorientating and confusing. I would like to touch on our ability to see with an understanding. Let's talk about sight or our vision. We already know that dementia is a progressive condition. We know that light-sensitive cells and the retina translate information. Retina cells carry information by the optic nerves into the brain to be processed, identify shapes, patterns, and cues to make sense of our environment when we look around us. We use shapes as building blocks to help us recognize objects. We can support our seniors living with dementia by providing environments and features within environments that are obvious to the eye. Features that are clear, recognizable, and can support seniors to carry out the activities of daily living. In addition, for some of us working or have worked with seniors, you may realize that many seniors may be living with multiple chronic conditions, one of which is visual impairment. Therefore, design features that provide clarity are beneficial not only for people living with dementia, but also for people living with visual impairment. On the topic of shapes, patterns, and familiar cues, let's have a look at this image on this slide. Many of us may have identified a hidden door, given that we could identify the shape of a door and the outline of the door frame. The additional cue of the light above may help enforce our beliefs that there is a door. However, this may yield different results for people living with dementia and with visual impairments, depending on their current prognosis. For some, this can be challenging to try and identify the elements within this image. I touched on how shapes, patterns, and cues can also help us identify things in the world around us. The brain may struggle to process information with deteriorating connections in the brain. With less appropriate visual stimuli, people living with dementia may fail to connect the shape in the wall with that of a door. They may not recognize the shape altogether or notice the additional light feature as a cue. This door may be ideal if you wish it out of sight and out of mind. But if this is a crucial entrance or exit, the inability to perceive the door will result in the door not being utilized for its means. If you want to get your message across quickly, keeping your design simple and understanding how to work with color contrast can help significantly with clarity. For instance, you can see these two images on the slide. You have two colors, black and red, and the red instantly stands out for the first one. This is because there are fewer elements to work with. When you look at the amount of information the brain is required to process, in terms of color, there are two colors for them to work with. Whereas with the other image below, you have shades of grey and beige, and it may seem overwhelming for a person living with dementia or with cognitive impairment. There are several individual pieces of information to process. First, the person has to identify every single aspect of the tiles. Next, the individual has to identify the colors to make sense of the images in front of them. The bottom line is that less is more. The brain processes information better in smaller, simpler chunks instead of huge masses that are highly complex. Let's talk about some occurrences that happen in reality. Some of you may work or care for loved ones, residents, or clients and have experienced this. When we are with the individual in an unfamiliar environment, we may be running late for an appointment, and suddenly we find that the person is refusing to take a step forward. They may appear confused and stressed, and they may not be able to articulate what the issue is. We look around and everything looks normal. So, what's going on? This has happened to me on several occasions. The issue wasn't around me, but it was below me. It was what was under our feet or on the ground. To give you a better idea, what does this look like? Place yourself in the shoes of a person who may have poor vision. Now think about how it may appear to a person grappling with issues with depth perception, identifying patterns and familiar cues. It may seem like the multiple steps or multiple three-dimensional cubes are coming out of the ground. However, this is just an ordinary pavement in an outdoor public space. But to a person who may have poor vision and cognitive impairments, this may seem like a really confronting space to navigate. For example, in our HDB flats, many of us may have modernized light switches. These light switches may be perfectly familiar because we see them at home or in the office. We see them everywhere, and that is a familiar element for us. However, it's an unfamiliar design feature for a person whose cognition has progressed to a stage where signs and symptoms are moderate or more severe. So these remote switches may not seem familiar to them at all. However, we can include multiple cues to help them identify the things around them and to help them identify that these are actually light switches. The images on this slide are not perfect. Still, it provides some idea of what people could do to provide some multiple cues at home or in a facility with modernized light switches. Here you have 3 stairs in 3 train stations found in 3 different countries. So let's look at these stairs and the impact they can have when it comes to enabling an individual. If you look at the image on the left, you can hardly see much contrast in the flooring, walls, and handrails. It is hard to distinguish the steps in between, especially when the lighting is poor. In addition, the entire environment appears almost to blend into each other. If you look at the image on the bottom right, you can see that visually this environment provides more guidance. However, the warm lighting in the environment can be improved to help visual clarity. The nosing on the stairs helps provide cues when it comes to navigation. For the image in the top right, you can clearly see the differences in the steps. This is because multiple cueing has been introduced in the environment. You can see arrows indicating up and down to inform people about which side of the stairs they should be going down. This can help to avoid any accidents. The yellow and red stripes can also help people understand which side of the stairs they should be on to keep with social norms and keep them safe. Auditory stimuli or sounds is an essential component. When we look at the design of the environment, we need to make sure that we consider the following points: culture, individual, and stimuli. On the topic of culture, in Singapore, many of us may be used to high-density living, environmental sounds experienced are of different intensity and frequency compared to those living in Australia or Iceland. Sounds mean different things to different cultures, and we know that the right intensity of sounds can be comforting. Some people we may be caring for or designing for may come from a home-like family. You may have 5 or 6 family members residing in the same unit. The sounds of people around them may bring comfort, whereas we may have clients that have lived alone all their lives in their flats and may not be comfortable with the sounds of large groups of people. Our environments should be designed to provide a range of auditory stimuli because everyone is different. Auditory stimuli sounds can be positive and negative depending on the environmental intervention and the context. Let's talk about olfactory stimuli smells. So this is a component that's not really touched on a lot in environmental designs. However, this is a critical component for many of us. We know that smells can motivate individuals to participate, especially in mealtime activities. It can help to orientate people as well. Smells can encourage individuals to make their way to dining spaces during meal times and increase appetite. It can also help with reminiscent activities because smells elicit positive memories and bring about conversation activities and social connections. And for many of us Singaporeans, it is common to find that many of us gather together for meal times. Whether we do it with work colleagues, family, or friends, many of us will always catch up over a coffee or a meal. And that is really normal behavior for a lot of us. So when we look at living and dining spaces, the ability to introduce olfactory stimuli may be an element that we wish to consider. On the same note, we may also want to think about how we can remove negative olfactory stimuli. For instance, are the linen skips and the rubbish being moved through living spaces leaving a smell? How can we design a space where we can remove items of negative olfactory stimuli away from residents to ensure that we don't trigger any responsive behaviors brought about by the smell? So what have we covered so far? When the environment is familiar, the person gains environmental mastery, therefore gaining control and receiving intrinsic rewards. Environmental mastery is a crucial factor in meeting the needs of empowerment and autonomy. When we talk about environmental mastery, we discuss how the environment contributes to the person's ability to choose or change things around them through their physical actions or thoughts. A person achieves environmental mastery when they are in an environment where they can actually do things for themselves and feel that they have control. This contributes to a person's well-being when faced with a progressive condition such as dementia. In terms of a person's emotional health, environmental mastery can allow a person to feel safe and comfortable in the space that they are in. Users can feel that their primary and immediate needs are met when they can move confidently within the environment. Another critical element that can contribute to improving a person's mental and emotional well-being when designing an environment is the size of the interior. Are all designs of the fixtures and fittings appropriate? Are handrails too high or too low? Are signs placed in an appropriate height and made visible even for people who may be in a wheelchair? Does the environment provide the appropriate density of social groups to enable social relationships? As I mentioned, there is a need to ensure a proper balance in terms of density that is found to be appropriate for Singaporeans. We know density varies from culture to culture. Lastly, we'll talk about intrinsic rewards. We know that individuals feel accepted and included when they have an environment that they can understand and make sense of quickly, enabling them to carry out activities and daily living. Principles of design can be found in the guidebook Looking to the Future, Inclusive Design for People Living with Dementia. This book is the second edition and serves as an update and expansion of the 2016 Looking to the Future, Designing and Managing Residential Facilities for People with Dementia, which was developed with references to evidence-based practices and in consultancy with the Dementia Nursing Home Design and Resource Panel, comprising local clinicians, operators, policymakers, and nursing home staff. The objective of this guide continues to focus on enhancing the environment with retrofits and minor adaptations, such as choice of furniture, to optimize the dementia friendliness of the environment to enable and support the person living with dementia. 6 principles in designing dementia-friendly facilities and spaces were identified and developed in Singapore. The 6 principles are safety, homely environment, meaningful participation, empowerment and autonomy, personal space and privacy, and appropriate environmental stimulation. So when we talk about principles of design, we know that safety is a considerable element. We need to ensure that we design a safe environment for seniors to move around. We also need a homely environment. The design should include familiar features that seniors can relate to and enable them to feel comfortable in their surroundings. Meaningful participation. So we know that the design should encourage seniors to participate in meaningful activities independently or as a group. We talk about empowerment and autonomy and how to design to support seniors in making choices. If you think about the environmental mastery that we touched on, control and the intrinsic rewards, these tie in very well with the understanding of the need for empowerment and autonomy. Next, we talk about personal space and privacy. We talk about how the design allows our seniors to be cared for in a respectful and dignified manner and cater to personal enrollment when needed. And as mentioned previously, we need to look at the needs of individuals. Everybody has different lived experiences, and everybody has a different understanding of their environment. And like I mentioned, many people may be used to spaces of high density, and some people may come from a home where they live only with their spouse. So in terms of visual, auditory, or even olfactory stimuli, it may be very different for each individual. So therefore, there's a need to look at personal spaces and privacy. Lastly, we talk about appropriate environmental stimulation. Here we talk about design, which should provide the appropriate level of sensory stimulation for seniors. And again, this is a really personal-centered aspect of the environmental design. We need to ensure that we have an environment that's flexible and balanced for a range of individuals. Lastly, I'll cover the principles of design that's utilized on a global scale. So these principles of design is currently being utilized in various countries. You can find more information about the principles of design and case studies in the Alzheimer's Disease International Report 2020. There are 10 principles of design. So let's get started. In the first one, we talk about how we can unobtrusively reduce risks, meaning safety features that are not obvious to the individual. Reduce the notions of being trapped, restrained, or locked in. For instance, you may have sluice rooms. We may have doors that lead to a dangerous environment for individuals living with dementia. And we may choose to introduce a feature that makes the door less evident to the individual. So we may camouflage a door with the same color as the wall or a mural. You would have seen an example of that in the initial slides. Next, we talk about providing a human scale. So the human scale differs between cultures. Here we talk about the size of the building, the density of the people within the building, and the sizes of fixtures and fittings. Next, we talk about how we allow people to see and be seen. And here again, this aligns very much with environmental mastery, because when people can clearly see the environment around them, they can see where they're going. It helps people to feel independent and empowered. For instance, if they walk into a space, they can clearly identify where the dining space is, the living space, and where the bathrooms are. Navigation for the person is easy. Whereas if a person comes out and you see a long corridor without any signage, it can be challenging and distressing because one may not know where the corridor leads to. Next, we will touch on reducing unhelpful stimuli and optimizing helpful stimuli. In terms of reducing unhelpful stimuli, one example will be the tiles we saw earlier, where we touched on the pavement containing intricate patterns on the ground. Stimuli doesn't have to be only smell and sounds, but sight as well. And when we talk about optimizing helpful stimuli, you can refer to the discussion we had on smells and olfactory stimuli. We must provide environments that support movement and engagement. A quick example is the discussion about stairs in 3 different countries. So for example, how can we support movement? How can we make it easy for people to actually move around? Some of the things we talked about for the lighting are the contrast between the floor and the walls. So for people that may be looking into dementia-friendly communities, this may be something that they may want to take note of. Next, we talk about creating a familiar place. As I've mentioned earlier, culture is a vital aspect. It is essential to look into our residents' backgrounds when designing an environment that supports familiarity and a sense of home in familiar design. Next, we touch on providing opportunities to be alone or with others. And again, here it is about creating spaces to meet the different needs of people living with dementia. Finally, we'll move on to link the community. So how can we have spaces that encourage the community to visit? For example, if we have a high care facility such as a nursing home, do we have spaces for visits? Do we have spaces for activities and family to come to visit? Do we have spaces for grandchildren to hang out when visiting their grandparents in a nursing home? And lastly, we talk about how to design in response to the vision for a way of life. So for instance, what is a model of care for the environment you are designing?